I'm David Morrison. As it was said, I'm with the agency formerly known as CEDA. I've been back and forth next door to DFATE all day, and not working on this, but there is a lot of talk about new acronyms, and whether it be DFAT-D or my favorite, which is Fat Diddy. But the point for this discussion is that the good work of CEDA, including in financial inclusion or support for financial inclusion, will continue in the new amalgamated department. We've had a good setup in the previous session to this session on the role of donors in financial inclusion. We've got a great panel. I work at CEDA now, but previously I worked at the UN Capital Development Fund, which is where I got to know our panelists today and many of you in the audience, so I know you'll be in good hands. Let's just jump right in. I didn't give him a heads up, but I am going to turn to Steve first to really just kick us off by giving us his vision of the role of a donor in supporting this new market system, which Joanna and others have talked about today. It strikes me that I wasn't personally involved in the early days, but it was a little bit easier being a donor back then, trying to figure out where to invest, how to put your money when we were essentially on the supply side. It's a lot more complicated with multiple actors. There were thoughts about infrastructure this morning. There's thoughts about how frankly you do market development without crowding out those that you're actually trying to crowd in. And I'd welcome Steve's thoughts on that.
Thank you, David. I think I got in trouble in the last session by trying to defend a position that I don't hold, so I'm going to stick to the line this time. I think otherwise I'm going to come back and ask Khalil for a job. But chapter 4 in this book was written by some of my colleagues, so I have to toe the line. And they're in the process of writing a new paper on the role of donors and funders, which all of you might be interested in when it comes out, including Kate Lauer, who's sitting here, is working on that. I think that, but to say this, I do think that in the book and in that chapter, there's this statement that, funding needs to be small, long-term, patient, and I might add, nimble and wise to that. Even if we take out wise, we still have nimble. And I really think that those things are important, but I would take your point that was easier to do sometime back and harder to do now. I think in terms of the role of donors, the one that comes up in the book is one I very much would agree with, and that's on really trying to be fund a facilitator or be a facilitator. Tough to do because you lose control. It involves letting go. It involves a lot of trust. And I'm not sure that works in donors' accountability systems anymore. But I really think that that's how it has to be. It's hard to sit and invent a program for 3 years or 4 years or 5 years and say it's going to be exactly that, and we're just going to hold you to that if you're doing market ecosystem development. A second thing I would say, beyond maybe what's in the book, but I really think that donors can, some at least, play a role in countries taking the policy discussion well beyond regulators. I think we're stuck into the regulator thing, and that's a tough one. Financial sector regulators and banks are an unholy alliance. And I think we've got to get this issue out where we tie in what we're doing to political objectives that are there. I think we need to be there with elected representatives. I think we need to be there with ministries. We need to get this story beyond, and I think that donors can play this role in some ways. They've got influence, or at least access, if not influence, in countries. The third thing I would say, just lastly, is that I think it would help if we could figure out how we measure what we mean by market development. You know, how do we describe this? What measures and indicators do we put to this? Because it's not easy to sort of sell that story within our own systems or to ourselves. And I wonder if it's not worth some investment on the part of funders to try and figure that out.
How to measure whether we're succeeding in deepening the market.
Yeah, and then what indicators do we use? I mean, go back to the early days of MFIs. You know, Bob was there doing this, the microbanking bulletin. I mean, it sort of changed the way we thought about things. And I wonder if we could get to something like that that would help us really on this front.
Okay, let's ask Anne to take it from there, including on this issue of how will we know if we're winning? I mean, you know, it used to be easier.
Yeah.
Whoa, that is a tough question. And I'm a relatively new donor. The
But a very important one.
MasterCard Foundation is, let's say, relative to other donors in the room, and certainly in the financial inclusion space, we're a relatively young donor in this field. We've been operating since 2008 with some of our first programs. And actually, while we have, I think, a meaningful portfolio, it is not huge in terms of the number of partners we work with. It's a little over 200 million. And it's, for the most part, fully focused on sub-Saharan Africa. So we have, I mean, we do fund some other work outside of sub-Saharan Africa, but it's largely that is sort of our focus and strategy. And I think our challenge is we have some constraints that go with that. So it's figuring out how to work within those constraints. But I think to some of the points that Steve talked about, where I think we can be more effective is identifying the right types of partners that can actually facilitate on our behalf. We can't be a direct player in the market. That's not our role. And I think while there are some institutions that we support directly, that's not a very big part of the portfolio. So I would say that in Chapter 4, we're probably one of those donors that sits in that pie where we're in the capacity building space rather than in the direct funding of microfinance institutions. So where donors perhaps have traditionally sat and actually continue to sit quite a bit, and we have heated debates about this at the CGAP annual meeting, which represents 33 some odd donors. We talk about what's the right role, and some of the institutions, you know, the mandate is harder to switch out of direct support to, let's say, market system development. But I think what we can do, and I think we support some of the work that's around market development. So we support things like Smart Campaign. We support things like the Mix. So some important actors who are helping to improve the infrastructure. The policy area is harder for us given who we are. We have very clear distinction between what the charitable objects are of the foundation and what our donor, who is MasterCard Worldwide, is doing. And we have to be very careful not to be furthering a private benefit interest of our donor. So unlike perhaps other foundations or other donors, we have to navigate fairly, we have to be careful. Some of the things that we're trying to do quite a bit on our team is to be more effective at a market level is really do our homework up front. I mean, that sounds obvious, but you'd be surprised how little is done sometimes. But at a country level, make sure you know what other donors are doing and that you don't I lost my... I'll shout. Okay. But make sure that you are not replicating what others are doing, and make sure that you're learning from lessons from people who've been there before. So that means taking stock of what impact studies have been done, what's been written, and trying to incorporate elements of that into the programming you're doing. So that's something you can do to be much more effective at a market level.
Sorry, you're not done.
Okay. And the other thing that I think we're doing more of is make sure that the programs or the partners that you're working with are not overlapping. So to the extent that we have knowledge about partners working around same types of programs in the same countries or a region, let's help facilitate collaboration at that level. And so we've done that actually a little bit in the mobile financial services space, and we've also done it in our industry strengthening work. We've actually brought SEEP together with MIX, with Center for Financial Inclusion, with Microfinance Transparency, people working in social performance, and we've said, sit down, talk together, and let's ensure that we're all complementing the work of each other. So I think in our capacity, we have this benefit, I think, in a way of being able to see things from a little bit more of a distance and do the best that we can to understand the lay of the land and see where the work that we're helping to support can be catalytic, can make a difference.
Great. Thanks very much, Anne. And I want to now use that to segue into Henri, because Anne has talked a little bit about donor coordination, and Steve talked about facilitation and also the need sometimes to go beyond regulators and to get buy-in at the political level, at the country level, if you will. And these are things that I know UNCDF has tried to work on at the country level. So over to Henri.
Thanks, David. I think what we have been trying to do is in a way, trying to answer some of the challenge we have put in front of in the new handbook. I think it's both getting better data to inform decision making, get a conversation going with a wider range of stakeholders at country level, and as you were saying, Steve, it's not only a conversation with regulators, but it's more a conversation around the political economy of financial inclusion and how to bring a much wider range of stakeholders. In a way, inviting, the ministries of agriculture, of social protection, of telecom, because they have a say and they have, an implied role on what will drive financial inclusion. And also being more proactive among donors to kind of also agree to do that work together and hopefully fund together what would become a national kind of financial inclusion strategy. So I would just say that, at CDF, what we realized is we needed to kind of fundamentally review the way we were doing our programming based on that. And that led us to partner with two organizations called FinMac Trust, which we mentioned this morning, who has developed this very powerful tool to assess demand and usage of financial services, FinScope. And then CENFRI, the Center for Financial Regulation and Inclusion, based in South Africa, who has done a lot of work around regulatory analysis and the supply side. And so we developed this kind of new programming, diagnostic and programming tool that we called MAP. So it rhymes well with kind of mapping the financial landscape, making access possible. And what we have been trying to do in the pilot that we have right now is first to get a much broader picture of financial access, so to use FinScope, do FinScope, but kind of use that to inform a programming agenda and link that with a kind of prospective analysis of what are the key drivers around financial inclusion. So how the innovation around delivery channel regulation going to play out to kind of shape options for government. And then try to have then a kind of a comprehensive diagnostic which can help to inform a discussion with country stakeholders on the government side, but also private sector, NGO community, and also among donors. and see how we can use that to inform the development of a national financial inclusion strategy led by the government and this larger range of stakeholders. So I think that illustrates well. I mean, I think the books, in a way, it's a fantastic guide to help us, to keep us honest on that endeavor and help us, assess where we are doing, the right thing and where we may kind of drift away. But I think it really confirmed the fact that we needed to change fundamentally the way we even talk about financial inclusion as a donor. That's what I would say.
Okay, great. We can open it up now. Very important questioner down here.
I'm interested in innovation. Can you talk a bit about how you are thinking about the innovation agenda along at least two dimensions? One is substantively, what areas do you think donors should be focusing on with respect to innovating products, delivery channels, what kinds of products, what kind of delivery channels, etc. And two, how should donors go about supporting innovation? What are you learning from other sectors, the way donors are talking about innovation in other sectors? For instance, this whole grand challenges model as one example, but I know that there are others as well.
Thank you, Hilal.
Did he say grant challenge?
He said grand challenges, which is
Yeah.
a methodology
Yeah.
or a scheme here in Canada to try to solve some of these problems. So there's lots of hands up. Let me, have we been taking sort of a round or, okay, let's, Bob, and then I'll turn to the panelists. So Bob.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a very related question, which is the morning framing was clients at the center. And how can donors engage with that agenda? And let me frame it just briefly. Version 1, it was easy. We donors financed everything. Version 2, we helped the capacity building of institutions to go to scale, and that led naturally to the policy agenda. And as budgets shrunk in a lot of donor agencies, it became a leverage issue, right? How do we leverage most powerfully our funds? Well, policy was a natural. The client agenda is not so natural, right? How do you go back and be supportive if you believe that we aren't even halfway there yet to getting the right kinds of financial services in the hands of the poor? So it's very related to Khalil's question about innovation. What can the role of donors be? Because it's not a natural progression for donors to move on to clients after having gotten the policy.
Right. There's a hand. We'll go here and then back here. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a brief question. Do you think donors need additional incentives to take risks, given what we now know about a lot of donors financing the same things in the same institutions and operating in the same space? And do you believe that additional rethinking is required in order to incentivize donors to finance things that might be out of their purview? And I would also, a very brief second question, what are your thoughts on donors funding research, and particularly given what we've learned about the industry with impact evaluations and also global findex and how transformative all of that's been? Thanks.
Okay, final question for this round down here.
Eugene Elman from Oiko Credit Canada. I'm interested in the panel's thoughts on the role of investors in this as well. Do you see it, microfinance primarily as an activity for the philanthropic sector, or is there a larger role for investors in the capital markets in this as well?
Okay, terrific. Why don't I ask Steve to start off, as the first question was on innovation, and I think he has that on his business card.
Applied product innovation, right?
I thought I could avoid that.
Minutes back on.
Why do I want to do this one? I'm not sure I've got a good answer, because I think that the issue is that by its nature, innovation tends to, move on, pretty quickly. It's not something you can, fund and you're stuck in for 5 years and you can report it back. I mean, it's a process. It's change that happens. And I really would go back to this thing of saying, I think, you know, a lot of this is setting up something or funding something that can be a lot more nimble than a donor can be. You know, it's back to the kind of facilitator role, but even within that, there are some more direct things. I mean, I'm not sure how Canada does this, uses the
Grant challenge.
The grant challenge, but certainly we've seen a lot of things happen with what we call challenge funds in other countries where, you know, in fact, the beginnings of M-Pesa go back to, you know, $1 million grant out of a challenge fund in DFID, interesting enough, for which DFID forever claims, you know, the 18 million clients out there, but all right, they were in first. But, you know, the point is that I think that there are mechanisms that can work, but they're not going to work so directly from the donor. They're going to work through something else that really is much more, let's say, entrepreneurial and much more able to read market signals and move on and do other things with it. But that's, I think, a difficult space sometimes for donors to be in.
Okay. Any other thoughts on the innovation question? Innovation's been mentioned, research has been mentioned. Henri?
I think it's very much, I mean, if we have a role to play as donors in supporting innovation, I think it links to the kind of criteria that I mentioned in the book. I mean, being able to use grant money flexibly in small amounts, you know, and with a very open agenda. So what we hope would come out of some of the MAP pilots we are launching is some ideas about partnership between financial service provider and delivery channel. Some kind of research that is needed by a ministry to think of moving a large-scale payment stream from cash or voucher into electronic platform. You know, a range of ideas that we don't even have any idea at the beginning, but which could be accommodated through a kind of a joint donor fund. I mean, like the FID has put in many countries, a financial deepening trust, or similar type of fund, where you basically support what's emerging from a diagnostic and an analysis which is very open-ended. I think if we have this kind of nimbleness, then probably we will be able to fund some idea which will happen to be game changer at country level. So, I mean, that's what I would say, but it calls for the kind of characteristic that the book mentioned in terms of how, you know, how donors should really facilitate the market development approach.
Anne?
So I would say that we've already started to fund some innovation. It may not look like what you might imagine, but we're working through partners such as CGAP and Steve's team to look at what they call applied product innovation, which is how do you bring in client design, how do you better understand from a design perspective products and services that serve the needs of the poor. So they're working actually with some innovators. We're not doing it directly ourselves, but we're working through our facilitator, in this case it's CGAP, or our partner, to hit that innovation. And it touches on Bob's question around, and there's some really interesting work going on now around, and it may not be so new anymore, around design-centered thinking. And how do you take something like what Apple did so well, you know, with the mouse, and how do you think about that in the context of financial services? And how do you apply that to poor people, low-income people? So CGAP is actually doing some interesting, innovative work around that we can support. So we're not doing it directly, but we're doing it through our partners. On the mobile money front, GSMA, mobile money for the unbanked, is doing some work around trying to better understand what's around, how do you get clients to go beyond just, you know, accessing a mobile money account? What causes usage? How do you sustain usage over time? How do you work with mobile network operators to better understand what the needs of those clients are? So actually, I think some of the focus that is coming around clients at the center is moving. I think we're seeing more and more activity around that. And that is the aspect, I think, of the work that can be innovative. And And I do think, whether it's DFID or other funders, there is definitely a role for us to play there. And the question is, how do we do it? We can do it through partners. We ourselves are examining what could a challenge fund look like. It won't be huge, but it might give us opportunities to do smaller programs that would support innovative ways to deliver financial services and products to the poor. So I don't know if you want me to address any of the other questions. Incentives to take risk. I hate this phrase. It comes from the corporate world, skin in the game. But if you have a partner, and UNCDF does this, so do other partners, which is in order to receive some kind of subsidized funding, you have to demonstrate, you have to show that you have something at risk as well. So UNCDF, through their, maybe Henri, you can explain that better than I, or Pam Easer, who's here in the audience and runs a very effective program called MicroLead. But they require the financial service partners to commit capital to the project, to the program. So it's not just receiving, subsidized funding. There may be other examples of how we can provide incentives, but that, to me, is a pretty compelling one. Pam or Henri, I don't know if you want to elaborate.
I think, Pam, you can say a word on that.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
But before, okay, go ahead.
Well, in the program that I manage, which is co-funded by MasterCard Foundation and Gates Foundation, it's a program to bring market leaders into underserved markets, least developed countries in particular. And we only provide 10% of funding for a greenfield, or even less than that. We definitely are not funding the full cost of bringing market leaders into new markets.
One thing I was going to add on Bob's question on the clients, maybe building on what you were saying, Anne, how to bring the client back, in the agenda, which is not an obvious thing for donors to support. I see different ways that we can do it more proactively. First is to, when, for example, there is a fin scope, whether it's done jointly through MAP or it's done independently. I think the power of good data on access, usage, and perception, when it's linked to a programming agenda and a discussion with a wider group of stakeholders at national level, I think can be a powerful way to focus the discussion on that. One of the things we're also exploring is how we could fund some kind of research linked to financial diaries. We're testing that in Myanmar, for example, how working with Stuart Rutherford, how to bring this really kind of granular analysis of clients' experience with financial services, and mostly in the informal sector there, but what are the needs, what are the transactions, what's happening? And then the challenge will be how we translate that findings and analysis into a good discussion about supply, about different models of delivery, about the appropriate level of regulations. So, I think kind of having a stronger systematic focus on the demand usage, financial kind of diaries dimension in the financial, in the kind of a mapping of financial sector would help us as donors to do it. But I agree that it's less obvious than to focus on the classical supply side discussion or on the classic engagement with regulators. It's one of the third pillar that needs to be built much more forcefully in our work as donors.
There's a question about investors.
Yeah.
Role of investors.
Did you want to try it?
Let me try that one.
Okay, Steve's going to try the question on investors.
Well, I'll try part of it. Yeah, I hope you have more to say, David. If I understood the question, part of it related to investment into microfinance institutions. I think on that front, there's a long track record. Bob mentioned it this morning. We've leveraged billions of dollars into this space, and I think that the there you've got a whole range of investors, including, straight out for-profit, kinds of investors who, fund things in technology companies in Silicon Valley. So and capital markets transactions are increasingly happening in many countries. A bond issue, another capital markets transaction that an MFI can do. Part of it depends on regulation, but I think there's enough business sense behind this, enough track record that it's a pretty known path. I think what's more difficult is the kind of space I work in, which is around using technology to get at financial inclusion. And there, a lot of times, we're not looking at something that could take any one of those investors. I mean, I've talked to any number of those investors about going into this or that or the other thing. It's below their risk appetite. I mean, what we're really talking about here is a venture capital type fund, or in some cases, we're talking about angel investors. We're working with an event right now in East Africa called Pivot East, which it takes a lot of these things that are happening out there around, digital financial service environments in East Africa, which are pretty significant now, and all the kinds of ideas that come out about how you can use this to further education or health or agriculture or solar energy or water provision or something else. And these guys are coming off the street, they don't even know what a PowerPoint is, which is probably a good thing. And, you're going through all of this process of trying to get this kind of, it's throwing up huge amounts of innovation. And we end up with maybe 25 or 30 who will, pitch to angel investors. None of those angel investors are from East Africa. We're bringing in angel investors from somewhere else. Now, if I go to India, sure, there's an angel investor club in Mumbai, I can go and pitch ideas. There's an angel investor club in Bangalore, I can go and pitch ideas. But, I don't know if, donors, back to Khalil's question, whether there's any space for donors to, put money into, angel investing. Well, I don't know, that's really high risk. But, maybe a VC fund of some kind, because a lot of what's there in even social investment funds today has got a size and a risk appetite and so on that's beyond what we need to get that really early stage innovation.
A little more time? Okay, so we can take a couple more questions and then wrap up. Or that may be it. Okay, one thought that I've had in listening to this is that I've kind of been, after several years intensely in the business, I've kind of been out of the business for a year. And, it's striking just how quickly this issue area moves. And, I kind of heard terms today that I was unfamiliar with, and I thought a year ago that I was familiar with everything. So I make the point simply because it comes back to some of the talk we've just had on innovation. I think that this whole field has proven itself incredibly innovative over the past couple of decades, which makes it much younger than many other fields. And we didn't. There's another program that MasterCard Foundation has funded UNCDF to do, which is on youth financial inclusion. So it's not innovation in terms of the challenge that Bob put forth this morning. I think kind of savings is at 35 cents right now, and it doesn't really get interesting till you get down to 10 cents. And how do you solve that challenge? It's a much more subtle form of innovation, and trying to innovate the models in such a way that they can include people, young people in this case, that are currently excluded from formal financial systems. And it strikes me that all of that is going to go on, is going on all the time, and will continue to go on. Henri talked a little bit about the new country-level tools that I think can play to some of the strengths of the proper role of donors when you're essentially dealing in a private sector-led issue area. And it's some of the ones that Steve mentioned right off the bat. It really is about facilitation. Access at the political level, when, as Henri said, you might need the Minister of Agriculture, the Minister of Telecoms, the Minister of Finance, the central bank governor all around the same table, and that doesn't actually happen nearly enough. In my own experience with UNCDF, we were doing some mobile money in Fiji, and it was actually quite easy because everybody knows each other. I mean, literally, the regulators see each other all the time. Much more difficult in a busier, crowded market like Pakistan. So, and those things are, of course, very difficult to control for. So with that, I think we'll bring it to a close. Thank you, and thank you to Khalil and his team, whom I think we're going to have some closing remarks right now. Thank you.
Thank you.